Charlie encountered the shop and laid the damp 50p on the counter. One Wonka Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mellow Delight, he said, remembering how much he had loved the one he had on his birthday. The man behind the counter looked fat and well-fed. He had big lips and fat cheeks and a very fat neck. The fat around his neck bulged out all around the top of his collar like a rubber ring. He turned and reached behind him for the chocolate bar. Then he turned back and handed it to Charlie. Charlie grabbed it and quickly tore off the wrapper and took the enormous bite. Then he took another and another. Oh, the joy of being able to cram large pieces of something sweet and solid into one's mouth. The sheer blissful joy of being able to fill one's mouth with rich, solid food. Looks like you wanted that one, Sonny, the shopkeeper said pleasantly. Charlie nodded, his mouth bulging with chocolate. The shopkeeper put Charlie's change on the counter. Take it easy, he said. He'll give you a tummy ache if you swallow it like that. Without chewing, Charlie went on wolfing the chocolate. He couldn't stop, and in less than half a minute, the whole thing had disappeared down his throat. He was quite out of breath, but he felt marvelously, extraordinarily happy. He reached out a hand to take the change. Then he paused. His eyes were just above the level of the counter. They were staring at the silver coins laying there. The coins were all 5-penny pieces. There were 9 of them altogether. Surely it wouldn't matter if he spent just one more. I think, he said quietly, I think I'll have just one more of those chocolate bars, the same kind as before, please. Why not? Said the fat shopkeeper, reaching behind him again and taking another Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mellow Delight from the shelf. He laid it on the counter. Charlie picked it up and tore off the wrapper, and suddenly, from underneath the wrapper, there came a brilliant flash of gold. Charlie's heart stood still. It's a golden ticket! Screamed the shopkeeper, leaping up about a foot from the air. You've got a golden ticket! You found the last golden ticket! Hey, you wouldn't believe it! Come and look at this, everybody! The kids found Wonka's last golden ticket! There it is! It's right here in his hands! It seemed as though the shopkeeper might be going to have a fit. In my shop, too, he yelled. He found it right here in my own shop. Somebody call the newspaper quick and let them know. Watch out now, Sonny. Don't tear it up as you unwrap it. That thing's precious. In a few seconds, there was a crowd of about 20 people clustering around Charlie, and many more were pushing their way in from the street. Everybody wanted to get a good look of the golden ticket at the lucky finder. Where is it? Somebody shouted. Hold it up so all of us can see it. There it is, there, someone else shouted. He's holding it in his hands. See the gold shining? How did he manage to find it, I'd like to know, a large boy shouted angrily. 20 bars a day I've been buying for weeks and weeks. Think of all the free stuff he'll be getting, too, another boy said enviously. A lifetime supply. He'll need it, the skinny little shrimp, a girl said, laughing. Charlie hadn't moved. He hadn't even unwrapped the golden ticket from around the chocolate. He was standing there very still, holding it tightly with both hands while the crowd pushed and shouted all around him. He felt quite dizzy. There was a peculiar floating sensation coming over him, as though he were floating up in the air like a balloon. His feet didn't seem to be touching the ground at all. He could hear his heart thumping away loudly somewhere in his throat. At that point, he became aware of a hand resting lightly on his shoulder, and when he looked up, he saw a tall man standing over him. Listen, the man whispered. I'll buy it from you. I'll give you 50 pounds. How about it, hey? I'll give you a new bicycle as well, okay? Are you crazy? Shouted a woman who was standing equally close. Why, I'd give him 200 pounds for the ticket. You want to sell that ticket for 200 pounds, young man? That's quite enough of that, the fat shopkeeper shouted, pushing his way through the crowd and taking Charlie firmly by the arm. Leave the kid alone, will you? Make way there. Let him out. And to Charlie, as he led him to the door, he whispered, Don't you let anybody have it. Take it straight home, quickly, before you lose it. Run all the way and don't stop until you get there. Understand? Charlie nodded. You know something? The fat shopkeeper said, pausing a moment and smiling at Charlie. I have a feeling you needed a break like this. I'm awfully glad you got it. Good luck to you, Sonny. Thank you, Charlie said, and off he went, running through the snow as fast as his legs would go. And as he flew past Mr. Wonka's factory, he turned and waved at it and sang, "I'll be seeing you! I'll be seeing you soon!" And 5 minutes later, he arrived at his own home. Charlie burst through the front door. "Mother! Mother! Mother!" Mrs. Bucket was in the old grandparents' room serving them their evening soup. "Mother!" Charlie yelled, rushing in on them like a hurricane. "Look, I've got it! Look, Mother, the last golden ticket! It's mine! I found some money in the street and I bought 2 bars of chocolate and the second one had the golden ticket and there were crowds of people all around me wanting to see it. And the shopkeeper rescued me and I ran all the way home and here I am! It's the fifth golden ticket, Mother, and I found it!" Mrs. Bucket simply stood and stared, while the four old grandparents who were sitting up in bed balancing bowls of soup in their laps all dropped their spoons with a clatter and froze under against their pillows. For about 10 seconds there was absolute silence in the room. Nobody dared to speak or move. It was a magic moment. Then, very softly, Grandpa Joe said, "You're pulling our legs, Charlie, aren't you? You're having a little joke." "I am not," cried Charlie, rushing up to the bed and holding out the large and beautiful golden ticket for him to see. Grandpa Joe leaned forward and took a close look, his nose almost touching the ticket. The others watched him and waited for the verdict. Then, very slowly, with a slow and marvelous grin spreading all over his face, Grandpa Joe lifted his head and looked straight at Charlie. The color was rushing back into his cheeks, and his eyes were wide open, shining with joy. And in the center of each eye, right in the very center, in the black pupil, a little spark of wild excitement was slowly dancing. Then the old man took a deep breath, and suddenly, with no warning whatsoever, an explosion seemed to take place inside him. He threw up his arms and yelled, "Yippee!" And that's the same time his long bony body rose up out of bed and his bowl of soup went flying into the face of Grandma Josephine. And in a fantastic leap, this old fellow of 96 and a half, who hadn't been out of bed these last 20 years, jumped in onto the floor and started doing a dance of victory in his pajamas. "Yippee!" he shouted. "3 cheers for Charlie! Hip, hip, hooray!" At this point the door opened and Mr. Bucket walked into the room. He was cold and tired, and he looked it. All day long he had been shoveling snow in the streets. "Cripes," he says, "what's going on here?" It didn't take him long to tell him what had happened. "I don't believe it," he said. "It's not possible." "Show him the ticket, Charlie," shouted Grandpa Joe, who was still dancing around the floor like a dervish in his striped pajamas. "Show your father the fifth and last golden ticket in the world." "Let me see it, Charlie," said Mr. Bucket, collapsing into the chair and holding out his hand. Charlie came forward with the precious document. It was a very beautiful thing, this golden ticket, having been made, so it seemed, from a sheet of pure gold hammered out almost to the thinness of paper. On one side of it, printed by some clever method in jet black letters, was an invitation itself from Mr. Wonka. "Read it aloud," said Grandpa Joe, climbing back into bed again at last. "Let's hear all exactly what it says." Mr. Bucket held the lovely golden ticket up close to his eyes. His hands were trembling slightly, and he seemed to be overcome by the whole business. He took several deep breaths, and then he cleared his throat and said, "All right, I'll read it. Here we go. Greetings to you, the lucky finder of this golden ticket, from Mr. Willy Wonka. I shake you warmly by the hand. Tremendous things are in store for you. Many wonderful surprises await you. For now, I invite you to come to my factory and be my guest for 1 whole day, you and all others who are lucky enough to find my golden tickets. I, Willy Wonka, will conduct you around the factory myself, showing you everything there is to see, and afterwards, when it's time to leave, you will be escorted home by a procession of large trucks. These trucks, I promise you, will be loaded with enough delicious eatables to last you and your entire household for many years. If at any time thereafter you should run out of supplies, you have only to come back to the factory and show this golden ticket, and I shall be happy to refill your cupboard with whatever you want. In this way you will be able to keep yourself supplied with tasty morsels for the rest of your life. But this is by no means the most exciting thing that will happen on the day of your visit. I am preparing other surprises that are even more marvelous and more fantastic for you, and for all my beloved golden ticket holders, mystic and marvelous surprises that will entrance, delight, intrigue, astonish, and perplex you beyond measurement. In your wildest dreams you could not imagine that such things could happen to you. Just wait and see. And now here are your instructions. The day I have chosen for this visit is the first day of the month on February. On this day, and no other, you may come to the factory gates at 10 o'clock sharp in the morning. Don't be late, and you are allowed to bring with you either one or two members of your own family to look after you and to ensure that you don't get into mischief. One more thing, to be certain to have the ticket with you. Otherwise, you will not be admitted. Signed, Willy Wonka. The first day of February, cried Mrs. Bucket, but that's tomorrow. Today is the last day of January. I know it is. Wow, said Mr. Bucket, I think you're right. You're just in time, shouted Grandpa Joe. There's not a moment to lose. We must start making preparations at once. Wash your face, comb your hair, scrub your hands, brush your teeth, blow your nose, cut your nails, polish your shoes, iron your shirt, and for heaven's sake, get all that mud off your pants. You must get ready, my boy. Get ready for the biggest day of your life. Now, don't overexcite yourself, Grandpa, Mrs. Bucket said, and don't fluster poor Charlie. We must all try to keep very calm. Now, the first thing to decide is this. Who's going to go with Charlie on to the factory? I will, shouted Grandpa Joe, leaping out of bed again. I'll take him. I'll look after him. You leave it to me. Mrs. Bucket smiled at the old man. Then she turned to her husband and said, How about you, dear? Don't you think you ought to go? Well, Mr. Bucket said, pausing to think about it. No, I'm not sure that I should. But you must. There are no musts about it, my dear, Mr. Bucket said gently. Mind you, I'd love to go. It'll be tremendously exciting. But on the other hand, I believe that the person who really deserves to go most of all is Grandpa Joe himself. He seems to know more about it than we do, provided, of course, that he feels well enough. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe, seizing Charlie by the hands and dancing around the room. He certainly seems well enough, Miss Bucket said, laughing. Yes, perhaps you're right after all. Perhaps Grandpa Joe should be the one to go with him. I certainly can't go myself and leave the other three old people all alone in bed for a whole day. Hallelujah! Shouted Grandpa Joe. Praise the Lord! At that point, there came a loud knock on the door. Mr. Bucket went to open it, and the next moment swarms of newspapermen and photographers were pouring in the house. They had tracked down the finder of the fifth golden ticket, and now they were all wanted to get that full story for the front pages of the morning papers. For several hours there was complete pandemonium in the little house, and it must have been nearly midnight before Mr. Bucket was able to get rid of them so that Charlie could go to bed. Chapter 13. The sun was shining brightly on the morning of the big day, but the ground was still white with snow and the air was very cold. Outside the gates of Wonka's factory, enormous crowds of people had gathered to watch the 5 lucky ticket holders going in. The excitement was tremendous. It was just before 10 o'clock. The crowds were pushing and shouting. The policemen, with arms linked, were trying to hold them back from the gates. Right beside the gate, in a small group that was carefully shielded from the crowd by the police, stood the 5 famous children, together with the grown-ups who had come with them. The tall, bony figure of Grandpa Joe could be seen standing quietly among them, and beside them, holding tightly onto his hand, was little Charlie Bucket himself. All the children except Charlie had both their mothers and fathers with them. It was a good thing that they had, otherwise the whole party might have got out of hand. They were so eager to get going that their parents were having to hold them back by force to prevent them from climbing over the gates. Be patient, cried the fathers. Be still, it's not time yet. It's not 10 o'clock. Behind him, Charlie Bucket could hear the shouts of the people in the crowd as they pushed and fought to get a glimpse of the famous children. There's Barbara Beauregard, he heard someone shouting. That's her all right. I can remember her face from the newspapers. And you know what? Somebody else shouted back. She's still chewing that dreadful old piece of gum she's had for 3 months. Look at her jaws. They're still working on it. Who's the fat boy? That's Augustus Gloop. So it is. Enormous, isn't he? Fantastic. Who's the kid with the picture of the Lone Ranger stenciled on his windbreaker? That's Mike TV. He's a television fiend. He must be crazy. Look at all those toy pistols he's got hanging all over him. The one I want to see is Veruca Salt, shouted another voice in the crowd. She's the girl whose father bought up 500,000 chocolate bars and then made the workers in his peanut factory unwrap every one of them until they found the golden ticket. He gives her anything she wants, absolutely anything. She only has to start screaming for it and she gets it. Dreadful, isn't it? Shocking.